She stood alone in the glittering ballroom, and no one saw her. Oh, they saw the Duchess of Ravenmore. They saw the magnificent sapphire gown, the perfect arrangement of golden hair, the jewels that caught the candlelight like captured stars. But they did not see her. They looked through her as if she were a portrait on the wall, something decorative and entirely forgettable. Evelina kept her gloved hands folded, her chin lifted, her expression pleasantly empty. She had learned that lesson within weeks of her marriage. Any flicker of sadness, any glimmer of hope would be devoured by the tongue's hungry whispers, so she gave them nothing. Across the ballroom, her husband was dancing with Lady Isabel Thorne. Alexander Ashworth, the Duke of Ravenmore, moved with that effortless grace that had made him the envy of every gentleman in London. Tall, dark-haired, impossibly handsome, he guided Lady Isabel through the waltz as if they were the only two people in the room. His head was bent toward her, his smile genuine in a way Evelina had never once received. The music swelled, the dancers turned, and Evelina remained perfectly still, a statue at the edge of the floor. "Poor thing," a woman murmured behind her, not quite quietly enough. "He hasn't looked at her all evening." Well, what did she expect? A merchant's daughter thrust into a duke's world. He only married her for her father's ships. The words hit like small, precise needles. Evelina had heard them 100 times before. She was the daughter of Sir Henry Marrington, a man who had built a shipping empire from nothing, who had been granted a barony for his service to the crown. She was new money, common blood, a convenient bride when the Duke of Ravenmore needed a fleet to secure a vital trade route. The marriage had been a transaction. She had known it from the start. What she had not known was how utterly he would erase her afterward. The waltz ended. Alexander bowed to Lady Isabel, his hand lingering on hers just a moment too long. Evelina watched, and something inside her chest cracked open, a tiny fissure that she pressed down with practiced control. He turned then, his gaze sweeping the room. It passed over her without stopping, without recognition, as if she were one of the potted palms. She slipped out onto the terrace before the first tear could fall, and she did not look back. The cold night air stung her cheeks. Below the stone balustrade, the gardens of Lord and Lady Ashford's estate stretched into darkness, silvered by a sliver of moon. She gripped the railing and let out a breath that shook. She had been married for 2 years. 2 years of silent dinners, of separate bedrooms, of ballrooms where her husband danced with everyone except his own wife. 2 years of telling herself that if she was patient enough, gentle enough, perfect enough, he would eventually turn his gaze toward her and see a woman worth loving. She was 24 years old, and she was exhausted. A single tear escaped, tracing a cold path down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly. She would not cry. She had cried enough in the first year to fill an ocean, and it had changed nothing. When she finally returned to the ballroom, her husband was still standing with Lady Isabel. He was laughing at something she said, his eyes warm with an ease Evelina had never inspired. That was the night she stopped hopping. The next morning, a note arrived on her breakfast tray. Evelina stared at the folded paper, her heart stumbling over itself before she could stop it. Alexander's handwriting. She had seen it so rarely that each time felt like an artifact unearthed. She opened it carefully. "I require a dinner to be hosted at Ravenmore House on Friday next. Several political associates will attend. Please see that appropriate arrangements are made. R." Not Evelina, not my dear, not even her title, just a command as cold and impersonal as a military order. And yet her foolish heart fluttered anyway. He was including her. He needed her. After 2 years of invisibility, he was finally giving her a role, a purpose. Perhaps this was the beginning of something. Perhaps he had noticed her withdrawal last night and felt a flicker of concern. She spent the next 5 days in a fever of preparation. She consulted with the cook, ordered flowers, arranged the seating with painstaking diplomacy. She chose her gown with trembling hands, a deep green silk that brought out the amber in her eyes, elegant but not ostentatious. She wanted him to see her. Just once she wanted him to truly see her. The evening arrived. The guests filed into the grand dining room, an array of lords and politicians and their glittering wives. Evelina stood at Alexander's side, receiving them with perfect grace, her smile measured, her curtsy precise. He introduced her as my wife, the Duchess of Ravenmore, but his voice held no warmth. It was a title recited, not a woman cherished. She still hoped. The dinner progressed. The food was exquisite, the wine flowed, the conversation turned to trade agreements and shipping routes. Evelina listened carefully, her own father's knowledge running in her blood, and when Lord Hargrave made a dismissive remark about the unreliability of merchant vessels, she could not stay silent. "Forgive me, my lord," she said, her voice gentle but clear, "but the Marrington ships have never lost a cargo to weather or piracy in 30 years. My father built his fleet with iron discipline, and his captains are the finest in England." A moment of silence. Lord Hargrave turned to her with a raised brow, surprise flickering in his aging eyes. "Indeed," he said slowly, "I had forgotten you were a Marrington before you were a duchess." "I have never forgotten," Evelina replied, with a smile that did not waver. A few guests chuckled. It was a small moment, but it was hers. She felt a flush of quiet satisfaction and allowed herself to glance toward Alexander. He was not looking at her. He was staring at his plate, his jaw tight, his knuckles pale around his wine glass. After a beat, he turned to Lord Hargrave and smoothly changed the subject. He did not defend her. He did not acknowledge her contribution. He simply erased it as he erased everything about her. Evelina's smile remained fixed, but something inside her began to close, petal by petal, like a flower retreating from the frost. When the guests finally departed, she stood in the empty hallway, the echo of carriage wheels fading into the London night. Alexander passed her without a word, his footsteps steady on the marble floor. "Alexander," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He paused but did not turn. "Was the dinner to your satisfaction?" "It was adequate," he said. And he walked away. She stood there for a long time, the silence pressing against her like a physical weight. Then she climbed the stairs alone, entered her cold bedchamber alone, and lay staring at the canopy until dawn crept gray through the curtains. She did not cry. She had stopped crying weeks ago. The next morning, Evelina did something she had never done before. She left the house without telling anyone where she was going. She took a hired carriage, because the Duke's splendid coach would draw too much attention, and she traveled beyond the fashionable streets of Mayfair to the eastern edges of the city. There, she visited a foundling home she had learned about from one of the housemaids, a crumbling, overcrowded place where orphaned children slept 3 to a bed and ate watery gruel once a day. The matron, a harried woman named Mrs. Pottle, stared at the elegant lady in disbelief when Evelina asked to see the conditions. "Your Grace, you shouldn't be here, it's not fitting." "Show me," Evelina said gently. She walked through the drafty rooms, the bare floors, the rows of thin blankets. She saw children with hollow eyes and chapped hands. She smelled damp and poverty and neglect, and something stirred inside her, something that had been sleeping for too long. She had spent 2 years trying to earn the love of one man. She had poured every drop of her soul into a vessel that could not hold it. But here were dozens of children who needed warmth, food, hope. She could not make a duke love her, but she could make a difference here. She began the very next day. Within a week, Evelina had quietly hired a solicitor to manage the financial arrangements. She used her own inheritance, the money her father had settled upon her before the marriage. It was hers, not the Duke, and she could spend it as she wished. She hired a young architect named James Hayward, a man of talent and modest reputation, to draw up plans for a proper orphanage on the Duke's country estate in Dorset. Ravenmore Hall sat amid thousands of acres, and there was an old, abandoned estate cottage that could be renovated and expanded. She told Alexander none of this. Why would she? He never asked where she went or what she did. He was hardly ever at Ravenmore House in London, and when he was, he inhabited a separate world entirely. So Evelina began to live two lives. By day, she was the invisible Duchess, attending dull social calls and smiling through endless dinners. By early morning or late afternoon, she escaped to meet with Mr. Hayward, to review plans and budgets, to visit the village and speak with the tenants. For the first time in years, she felt her lungs expand. She felt purpose. James Hayward was a quiet man with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers. He never treated her like a duchess. He treated her like an intelligent woman with good ideas, which she discovered she had in abundance. She understood logistics from her father's business. She understood budgeting and negotiation. She was not merely a patron, she became a partner in the project. One afternoon, they walked together along the rutted lane that led from the cottage site toward the main estate. The autumn air was crisp, the hedgerows golden, and James was explaining the drainage challenges with a contagious enthusiasm. "I think if we divert the spring here," he said, gesturing with a rolled-up plan, "we can create a proper wash-house and a small kitchen garden. The children could even help tend it." Evelina smiled, a real smile, the kind she had not worn in so long that her cheeks almost ached. "You make it sound like a paradise, Mr. Hayward." "It could be, Your Grace. It should be. Every child deserves a piece of paradise, don't you think?" She paused, her gaze drifting over the rolling Dorset hills. "Yes," she said softly, "I do." They stood there in companionable silence, the wind pulling gently at her cloak. She did not notice the rider on the distant ridge, the dark figure on a black horse who had stopped and was watching them with an expression that shifted slowly from indifference to something far sharper. The Duke of Ravenmore had come to the country estate unexpectedly, seeking solitude after a frustrating week in Parliament. He had not expected to find his wife laughing in a lane with a strange man. He did not ride down to meet them. He turned his horse and galloped back toward the hall, a bitter taste flooding his mouth. It was not jealousy, he told himself. It was irritation, propriety. The Duchess had no business traipsing about with an architect of all people. It was unbecoming. It was careless. It was something that made his chest feel strangely tight. He did not examine the feeling. He buried it deep, where all his feelings went to rot. That evening, he sought her out for the first time in months. Evelina was in the small sitting room she had claimed as her own, a cozy space with a fire and a window overlooking the garden. She was reading a report from the stone mason when the door opened without a knock. She looked up, startled. Alexander stood in the doorway, still in his riding boots, his dark hair windswept, his gray eyes unreadable. "You were in the village today," he said. It was not a question. Evelina lowered the paper carefully. "Yes, I had business there." "With Mr. Hayward." She blinked. "You know his name." "I make it my business to know who spends time with my wife." The word "my" landed like a stone in still water. She had almost forgotten she belonged to anyone. She had been feeling so wonderfully, dangerously free. "Mr. Hayward is an architect," she said calmly. "I have commissioned him to renovate one of the estate cottages for a charitable project." Alexander's jaw tightened. "You did not think to consult me. Would you have been interested?" The question hung in the air, quiet and devastating. She watched his face flicker, a muscle twitching in his cheek, but he did not answer. "It is my project," she continued, her voice steady, "funded by my inheritance. I did not think it required your attention." He took a step into the room. "Everything on my estate requires my attention." "Then perhaps you should have paid attention sooner." The words were out before she could stop them. She saw them strike him, saw the subtle recoil in his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he turned and left, the door closing behind him with a sharp click. Evelina sat frozen, her heart pounding. She had never spoken to him like that before. She had always been deferential, accommodating, desperate for any scrap of his approval. But she was not desperate anymore. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped needing him to love her. It was terrifying. It was liberating. It was grief and relief tangled together. She picked up the Mason's report and continued reading. Her hands were steady. The weeks that followed brought a shift so subtle that Evelina barely noticed it at first. The Duke began appearing in places he never used to be. When she took breakfast in the morning room, he would wander in with a newspaper and sit at the opposite end of the table. When she returned from the village, she would find him in the library, the door open, his eyes lifting to track her passage through the hall. He did not speak to her more than necessary, but he watched her. She felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch, and it unsettled her more than she cared to admit. One gray November afternoon, Evelina was in the estate office, poring over ledgers with the steward, Mr. Finch. She had discovered, quite by accident, a disturbing pattern in the accounts. The estate was hemorrhaging money. Debts she had never known existed were creeping like ivy through the columns of numbers. Loans against the land, unpaid creditors, investments gone sour. Mr. Finch grew pale when she asked him directly, "Your Grace, I am not at liberty. The Duke does not wish these matters discussed." "I am the Duchess," she said quietly. "I am not asking as a gossip. I am asking as a woman who wants to help." The steward hesitated, then slowly, reluctantly, laid bare the truth. Alexander had inherited a mountain of debt from his father. Years of poor harvests and bad investments had eroded the Ravenmore fortune. The marriage to Evelina had been a desperate measure. Her father's ships and her dowry had shored up the estate temporarily, but the cracks ran deep. Now the creditors were circling again, and the Duke was struggling to keep them at bay in secret. Evelina listened in silence. The pain that washed through her was not for herself. It was for him. Alexander, so proud, so cold, carrying this burden entirely alone. She understood then that his distance might not have been merely disdain. It might have been shame. She did not confront him. She did not even let him know she had discovered his secret. Instead, she visited her solicitor in London the following week and quietly, secretly, began paying off the most pressing debts. She used her own funds, the last of her mother's jewelry, and a small inheritance from an aunt. The transactions were routed through an intermediary, so the Duke would never trace them to her. She asked for nothing in return. She did not expect his gratitude. She simply could not watch his world crumble if she had the means to save it. The orphanage, meanwhile, was taking shape. The cottage had been stripped to its bones and rebuilt with warmth and light. James Hayward had designed dormer windows to catch the morning sun, a kitchen large enough for communal meals, and a schoolroom with a fireplace. Evelina visited often, her boots muddy, her hair escaping its pins, her smile coming more easily every day. The villagers began to speak of her with genuine affection. "The Duchess has a good heart," they said. "Not like the Duke, she actually sees us." The words traveled back to the hall, carried by servants and tenants, and they reached the Duke's ears like the persistent drip of water on stone. One evening, Evelina returned late, her cloak damp with drizzle, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She entered the front hall to find Alexander waiting. He was standing by the great staircase, his arms crossed, his expression dark. "You were with Hayward again," he said. She untied her cloak slowly, handing it to the footman who had materialized silently behind her. "I was at the building site. There was a problem with the roof timbers." "You spend more time with that man than you do in your own home." "This is my home," she said, meeting his eyes. "But I have responsibilities beyond its walls now. I did not think you would mind. You have never been concerned with how I fill my days." He flinched. She saw it, a tiny break in his composure, and it almost made her relent. But she held firm. She was not going to apologize for building a life. "I am concerned now," he said, his voice low and rough. "The entire county is talking about my wife and her architect." Evelina felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she refused to look away. "Then let them talk. Mr. Hayward is an honorable man, and my conscience is entirely clear. If you believe otherwise, that is your burden, not mine." She walked past him and up the stairs, her heart hammering, her spine straight. She did not look back. She did not see the way his hands clenched at his sides, or the way his eyes followed her until she disappeared from sight. The winter deepened, and so did the distance between them. But the distance was different now. Before, it had been a desert of indifference. Now it was charged with something electric, something neither of them would name. Alexander began to crack, though he hid it badly. He found himself lingering in doorways where he might catch a glimpse of her. He listened for her voice in the corridors. He replayed her words, "I did not think you would mind," and they cut him every time because the terrible truth was that he did mind. He minded desperately. Her absence was a wound that would not close. He began to notice things he had ignored for years. The way she tilted her head when she read, the soft hum of concentration. The way she treated the servants with genuine kindness, remembering their names, asking after their families. The way the entire household seemed to warm in her presence. And he noticed, with a cold jolt, that she had stopped seeking his presence entirely. She no longer lingered after dinner hopping for conversation. She no longer left flowers on his desk. She no longer waited up when he worked late. She had built a world that did not include him, and he was only now realizing that the world was beautiful, and she was beautiful, and he had been a fool of monumental proportions. The first true crack in his armor came at a Christmas ball, hosted by the Earl of Dunmore. Evelina attended because her absence would cause more gossip than her presence. She wore silver silk that shimmered like frost, and she moved through the crowd with the poise of a queen. She was no longer the shrinking, hopeful bride of 2 years ago. She was a woman who had found her own footing. Alexander watched her from across the room, and what he felt was not irritation or ownership. It was longing, a deep, aching longing that terrified him. Then Lady Isabel Thorne appeared at his elbow, her smile practiced, her perfume cloying. "Alexander, it has been too long. You look haunted, my dear." "I am well," he said, his eyes still tracking his wife. Isabel followed his gaze, and her smile sharpened. "Ah, the merchant's daughter. I see she's finally captured your attention. A pity it took her ignoring you to do it." He did not answer. His jaw was tight. Across the room, a man approached Evelina. Captain Marcus Redfern, a naval officer newly returned from the Caribbean, a distant cousin of the host. He was broad-shouldered, sun-bronzed, and his smile was easy as he bowed over Evelina's hand. "Your Grace, I have heard remarkable things about your orphanage project," he said warmly. "My own mother runs a charitable school in Portsmouth. May I have the honor of a dance and a conversation?" Evelina hesitated. She felt Alexander's eyes on her like a brand. Then she lifted her chin and placed her hand in Captain Redfern's. "I would be delighted, Captain." They danced. They talked. Evelina laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh at something the captain said. Alexander stood rigid as a statue, his wine glass threatening to crack in his grip. Isabel's voice faded into meaningless noise. The room narrowed to the image of his wife in another man's arms, smiling in a way she had never smiled at him. The jealousy hit like a physical blow. It stole his breath. It clawed at his chest. He had no right to feel it. He knew he had no right, and that made it burn even hotter. When the dance ended, he was moving before he could stop himself. He intercepted Evelina near the terrace doors, his hand catching her elbow with more force than he intended. "We are leaving," he said, his voice a low growl. She looked up at him, startled and then guarded. "I was not aware we had a schedule." "Now, Evelina." She extracted her arm from his grip with quiet dignity. "I am not a child to be ordered about. If you wish to leave, you may leave. I will return with the Dunmores later." For a moment he was struck speechless. The wife who had once hung on his every word was looking at him as if he were a stranger. No, worse, as if he were an inconvenience. Captain Redfern appeared beside her, his expression polite but watchful. "Is there a problem, Your Grace?" Alexander's gaze snapped to the captain, and the look in his eyes was murderous. "No problem. I was merely reminding my wife of the hour." "How thoughtful," Evelina said, and the irony was so sharp it could have cut glass. She turned her back on him. She turned her back, and she walked away with the captain, leaving Alexander standing alone in the crowded ballroom, drowning in the realization that he had lost her completely. The carriage ride back to Ravenmore House was silent. Evelina stared out the window at the frost-glittered streets. Alexander sat opposite her, his hands clenched on his knees, 100 words choking in his throat. When they arrived, she moved toward the stairs without a good night. "Evelina," his voice cracked on her name. She paused, her hand on the banister. She did not turn. "I saw you with Redfern," he said hoarsely. "I saw the way you smiled at him." "Yes," she said quietly. "I smiled. It has been a long time since I had reason to." He flinched as though she had struck him. "Do you have feelings for him?" She turned then, and her eyes were so terribly sad. "Does it matter to you, Alexander, truly? You have not looked at me in 2 years. You have not shared a meal with me, a conversation, a single moment of genuine warmth. I have been a ghost in your house, and now you ask if I have feelings for another man." "I am asking," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "because I need to know." She studied him for a long moment. "No," she said finally, "I do not have feelings for the captain, but I also do not have feelings for you. Not anymore. I cannot afford to. I gave you every piece of my heart, and you handed them back to me one by one without ever noticing they were offered. So no, Alexander, you do not need to worry about Captain Redfern. You need to worry about the fact that I have finally learned to live without you." She climbed the stairs and disappeared into the darkness. He stood in the hall for a long time, motionless, the echo of her words reverberating through him like a funeral bell. The next day he went to her study to find her. She was not there, but her ledgers were spread across the desk. He meant to leave, he had no right to pry, but his eye caught a familiar name, his solicitor's name, and a list of debts, his debts. He leafed through the pages, his hands beginning to tremble. Payment after payment, all routed through an intermediary, all originating from her personal accounts. Thousands of pounds. She had been quietly, methodically, saving him from ruin. She had been saving him, while he had been ignoring her, resenting her, treating her like a stranger. He sank into her chair, the papers scattered around him, and he buried his face in his hands. A sound escaped him, half groan, half sob. He had been so blind, so arrogantly, catastrophically blind. He found her in the garden, standing by the frozen fountain, her cloak wrapped tight against the bitter wind. She was watching a robin peck at a scattering of breadcrumbs. "Evelina." She turned, and the guarded look was back in place, but it flickered when she saw his face. His eyes were red-rimmed. His composure was shattered. "I found the ledgers," he said. "I know what you've done." She did not deny it. She simply waited. "Why?" The word was torn from him. "Why would you do this for me when I have given you nothing but coldness?" She looked at the robin, not at him. "Because I loved you, and because the estate's collapse would hurt the tenants, the servants, the people who depend on Ravenmore. It was not only for you." "Loved," he repeated, seizing on the past tense like a drowning man grabbing air. "You said loved." "Yes," she said softly, "past tense." He moved toward her, closing the distance between them, and she did not retreat. But neither did she reach for him. She just stood there, calm and distant as a winter sky. "I was a fool," he said, his voice breaking. "I was proud and angry. I resented the circumstances of our marriage. I resented that I was forced to marry to save my family's legacy. But I never resented you, Evelina. I resented myself. And I took it out on you in the cruelest way possible by making you invisible. I made you invisible, and you are the most extraordinary person I have ever known." She closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and she brushed it away quickly, but not before he saw. "Do you know what I heard on our wedding night?" she whispered. "I was coming to find you. I thought perhaps we could talk, begin our life together as friends if nothing else. I heard you speaking to your cousin. You said, 'I will never love a merchant's daughter. This marriage is a cage, and she will never be more than a duty to me.'" Alexander went white. The memory surfaced with brutal clarity. He had been bitter, drinking, venting to the one person he trusted. He had spoken careless words he did not truly mean, words born of frustration and fear. And she had heard them, on their wedding night. "Evelina," his voice was a ruin. "I was a stupid, angry young man. Those words were never true. They were a shield because I was terrified of being vulnerable. I have spent 2 years convincing myself I felt nothing so I wouldn't have to face how much I actually felt. But I felt it anyway. I feel it now. I am in love with you. I think I have been for a long time, and I was too much of a coward to admit it." She opened her eyes. They glistened with unshed tears, but her gaze was steady. "How do I trust that? How do I know this is not guilt speaking, or jealousy, or the shock of me finally stepping away?" "You don't," he said simply. "You don't know, and I don't deserve your trust, but I am begging you, give me the chance to earn it. Let me try. Not as the Duke who ignored you, but as a man who has finally, painfully, learned what he stands to lose." The wind blew between them, sharp and cold. The robin flew away. For a long moment she said nothing, and he felt the abyss yawning beneath him. Then she reached into the pocket of her cloak and withdrew a small folded paper. She handed it to him without a word. He opened it. It was a letter dated 3 days ago from her solicitor. It stated that she intended to establish a permanent residence at the orphanage, separate from the Duke, and was requesting a legal separation. His hands shook. "You were going to leave me." "I was," she said. "I had decided. I was going to tell you after Christmas." He looked at her, and his eyes were desperate, shattered, utterly vulnerable. "Please don't. Please stay. Not as my Duchess. Not as my duty. Stay as my partner. Stay because I cannot imagine this world without you in it. Stay because I will spend every day of the rest of my life trying to make you smile the way you smiled in that garden with Hayward. I want to be the reason you smile. I want to be the reason you feel seen." She looked at him for a very long time. She saw the lines grief had carved around his eyes, the trembling of his hands, the raw, unguarded plea in his expression. He was not the cold Duke. He was just a man, terrified and in love. "I am not the girl who waited for you anymore," she said quietly. "I am different now, stronger. I will not shrink to fit your expectations." "I don't want the girl who waited," he said. "I want you, the woman who rebuilt an orphanage with her own hands, the woman who saved my estate in secret, the woman who is standing in front of me looking like she could walk away and be perfectly fine. I want that woman. I love that woman." Another tear fell, and this time she did not wipe it away. She let it trace a silver path down her cheek, and she let him see it. "I'm not promising you forever," she whispered. "Not yet, but I'm willing to try a beginning, a real one." He let out a breath that sounded like a sob of relief. He reached for her hand, and after a heartbeat of hesitation, she let him take it. His fingers were cold, but they held hers with desperate gentleness. "Thank you," he breathed. "Thank you." They stood together in the frozen garden, hand in hand, the silence no longer empty but full of fragile, trembling hope. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. They were something truer, something harder and more precious. Alexander did not try to overwhelm her with grand gestures. He did not shower her with jewels or hollow compliments. Instead, he showed up. Morning after morning, he joined her for breakfast. He asked about her plans for the day, and he listened, truly listened, to her answers. He visited the orphanage with her and met the children. He rolled up his sleeves and helped haul timber for the new dormitory, earning a smile from James Hayward, who saw the change in him and welcomed it. When spring came, the orphanage opened. The local bishop blessed the building, but Alexander insisted on a second dedication. He commissioned a stone plaque above the entrance. It read simply, "A haven for the heart, founded by Evelina, Duchess of Ravenmore. She saw the invisible, and she loved them into being." Evelina wept when she saw it. Not sad tears, grateful tears, the kind that wash a soul clean. That summer they walked together through the gardens of Ravenmore Hall, the roses in full bloom, the air sweet with honeysuckle. She was talking about a new school for village girls, her hands animated, her eyes bright. He was watching her with an expression of pure, unguarded wonder. "What?" she asked, catching his gaze. "I was just thinking," he said, "that I almost missed this. I almost missed you, and I don't think I would have survived it." She slipped her hand into his. "You didn't miss me. You found me just a little late." "I loved you too late," he said, echoing her earlier fear. She shook her head, a soft smile curving her lips. "No, you loved me exactly when I was ready to believe it. Perhaps that's not too late at all." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of reverence, of gratitude, of a love that had been forged in the fire of loss and regret and emerged stronger than before. They walked on, into the golden light of the afternoon, together at last. Not the cold Duke and his invisible Duchess, just Alexander and Evelina, two people who had lost each other and found each other again. The future stretched before them, not as a cage but as a garden, and they would tend it together, side by side, for all the years to come.